Hi AP Psych class, welcome to video number 1 of Unit 6 on learning. Part 1 is on classical conditioning. And so actually before we begin with classical conditioning, let's just talk about the general introduction to the chapter. Unit 6 is on learning, and your definition of learning, according to your textbook, is a relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience. And so we say relatively permanent because obviously not everything that a person or animal learns will be remembered forever, but if the behavior has been shaped relatively permanently, then we would say that they have learned something. How do we learn? Well, there's lots of good examples of that. That's what there are 3 different theories that we're going to talk about in this unit. Know that the first thing that's mentioned, habituation, is actually kind of learning to ignore things. Habituation is an organism's decreasing response to a stimulus with repeated exposure to it. And so think about our sensory adaptation that we learned about in Unit 4. If something is a constant bombardment of stimuli, there comes a point where we choose to not pay attention to things. Is that an example of learning? Sure, yeah, in that you've learned to tune things out. Hopefully not the sound of my voice during these videos. That would be bad for learning. But the big theories that we're going to learn about in this video are in this unit are going to be associative learning and conditioning. This video is about classical conditioning, called classical because it's the original view. We then have a later theory of associative learning and conditioning called operant conditioning. That'll be video 2. And then finally, observational learning, which will be video number 3 or part 3 of this unit. All right, so that's just your general overview, but let's look at classical conditioning specifically. All right, your definition of classical conditioning is that it's a type of learning where a person or animal learns to link 2 or more stimuli. All right, so we are associating 2 stimuli together in classical conditioning. It comes from the school of psychology known as behaviorism, which, if you recall from Unit 1, is the view that psychology should A, be studied as an objective science, which means B, that we should study simply observable behavior and pay no mind to mental processes. Remember that come cognitive revolution of the 1960s, most psychologists would disagree with point B of behaviorism, but just remember that behaviorism is what shapes classical and operant conditioning, in that we are looking solely at observable behavior in both of those instances. That leaves some weaknesses in both theories, which we'll discuss when we get to theory number 3 on cognitive or observational learning. All right, the man of the hour for classical conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. He was a Russian physiologist that actually won a Nobel Prize in the early 1900s for his work in gastroenterology. In one of his famous experiments, he inadvertently discovered or came up with this theory of psychology. So he's quite famous in a field that he did not intend to be famous in. But what he was doing was studying the digestive tracts of dogs. And he was actually measuring the amount of saliva that dogs produced when eating. And so he had a bunch of dogs in his labs that were all hooked up to these little tube devices that would collect and measure the amount of drool that they made when feeding time came. And what was interesting is that Pavlov and his associates began to notice that with repeated experiments, the dogs in the lab actually began salivating prior to receiving food. And there seems to be no real purpose for this, in that saliva is what breaks down food during the eating process. And so Pavlov became curious as to why. Why are they drooling before they've received food? And that's what led him to discover or formulate this theory of learning. And so the vocab that you need to know, USUR, NS, US, or CSCR, you'll hear those abbreviations a lot in this unit. All right, so let's break them down. A stimulus is anything that causes a reaction. We'll call that reaction a response. Unconditioned just means not conditioned or not learned. And so when we say US leads to a UR, we're talking about something that causes a reaction naturally, something we do not have to teach the learner. And then what we do is we introduce a neutral stimulus or something that means nothing to the learner. It's not good, it's not bad. When we pair this neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, we'll get that unconditioned response. So I'm not going to put you through the pain of this conditioning, but in my sick mind, here is the example I have developed. I scream. You jump. Scream is the unconditioned stimulus. Jumping is the unconditioned response. I pair my scream with a clown picture that appears on the screen before you. And the clown initially is the neutral stimulus, not good or bad. But if I show you the clown picture and always scream as I'm showing it to you, in other words, I pair those two stimuli together, you begin to learn an association between those two stimuli. And eventually, with several repeat performances of clown picture and me screaming, eventually the clown picture on the screen alone, without my scream, would probably cause you to jump. Right? And so the easy way to check these practice equations that we do in class will be to know this. Your response is always the same. We just call it unconditioned prior to learning, and we call it conditioned after learning. The stimulus, that is the neutral one, will become the conditioned stimulus after learning has happened. And so your CS and your NS are always the same, and your UR and your CR are always the same. That's an easy way to double check your work when we do our practice problems. All right, but there's lots of other vocab involved with classical conditioning, lots of verbiage. Acquisition is just the fancy word for that initial connection between an NS and a US. And so when you've acquired the learning, or the first time you've learned that association between those two stimuli, we call it acquisition. Higher order conditioning, or sometimes it's called second order conditioning, is just going to be taking a CS and pairing it with a new NS, so that a second but often weaker CS is learned. Okay, we'll do some examples of that in class. But taking what used to be an NS that's now a CS, pairing it with another NS to elicit that same response is called higher order conditioning. Extinction, hey, that's the fancy term in classical conditioning for forgetting something. When a learned response diminishes, we call it extinction. That's probably a result of that CS and US not being paired together anymore. And so sometimes reconditioning or relearning is needed. And that's when we take that US back into the equation to again strengthen that association between the CS and the US. So sometimes a refresher course may be needed concerning a learned response. Sometimes a response is extinct, but then comes back without any sort of prompting. That would be the spontaneous recovery, when a forgotten piece of information comes back. Often weaker, the response is usually weaker, but it does sometimes return without any reconditioning. Stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Generalization, if you generalize, you're lumping things together. So that just means that once a CR is learned, it's the tendency to respond the same way to stimuli that are similar to the CS. Discrimination means that you can distinguish between them. And so even if stimuli are similar, you won't respond in the same way to them. A great example of this is that one time, I don't even remember how old I was, I ate a bunch of Fritos, the little slivers of corn chip product stuff. Yeah, I can't even talk about it. Notice I'm stumbling over my words. Why, you ask? Because I was wicked sick. I don't think it was a result of the Fritos. It was probably the result of a flu virus. But the pairing of the neutral stimulus of Fritos with the unconditioned stimulus of a virus began to associate those two, and then that meant that just seeing Fritos or smelling Fritos, or thinking about Fritos makes me want to vomit. A generalization would be the acquisition of my taste aversion. Generalization would mean that I respond in the same way to any stimuli similar to Fritos. So Doritos, Tostitos, any other corn chip type product. If it made me want to throw up, that would be a generalization. Fortunately for me, it's just the Fritos. I'm a huge fan of the other corn chip products, so in real life know that I experience stimulus discrimination. Okay, we're almost through classical conditioning. Practice, practice, in class will make all of this make more sense. Know this, that concerning its main weakness here is that classical conditioning often tries to ignore any sort of mental or cognitive process in learning. And we know that that's simply not true. Okay, a couple of examples. Rescorla and Wagner actually did experiments that showed that animals can learn the predictability and expectancy of events. How do they do that without directly being conditioned to respond that way? They're using their little animal brains to think about it. And so you can't ignore that. We also, if you remember from your 40 studies reading over the summer, have Martin Seligman and The Shocking of Dogs and learned helplessness. So even though the behaviorists would like to claim that we are pure like beasts of conditioning and that we simply are just reacting to stimuli in our environment, we know that our thought process plays a role. So know that the cognitive process in learning is the weakness of classical conditioning. Okay. We also know that classical conditioning only works really well when you link it with biological predispositions. And so know that conditioning in this manner is constrained by our biology, right? And that, the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response has to be something we're biologically predisposed to do, right? And that we're not taught that. Right, so other than higher order or second order conditioning, things are hinged upon biology. So that's a little bit of a weakness there as well. Some other good things, though, about classical conditioning. We don't just want to knock it down. Pavlov's legacy. Every organism can learn something through classical conditioning, from the sea slug mentioned in your reading of Unit 6, to humans. And so it's also cool because he was the first to show you that you can study learning in an objective and scientific way. And so, kudos to Pavlov. And there's also some really cool applications of classical conditioning. Think about your 40 studies reading of Watson and Rayner's experiment on little Albert, right? Conditioning a kid to fear a white rat. So phobias, right? We can talk about classical conditioning as the acquisition of the phobia, and we can also talk about it as a way to overcome phobias, right? Using the methods of flooding, systematic desensitization, and counter conditioning. Okay, and so I specifically have something that we will do in class to show you how those three methods of classical conditioning can be used to help people overcome phobias. Predator control. There are actually ranchers out west that will prevent coyotes and wolves from attacking their herds of cows and sheep by leaving out poisoned pieces of sheep meat and cow meat. And so when these wild animals take this food back to the pack, and all of the wolves get sick, they kind of learn to avoid those ranchers' animals. And so that's a really cool application of this. That's a taste aversion or a learned avoidance of a particular food as a result of it being paired with an illness. And so people can develop taste aversions as well. And then detecting explosives like bomb dogs in the military or in police forces have actually been conditioned to do that using these same techniques that we just talked about. And so, despite its flaws, it still has a lot of merit to it as a form of learning. It's just a theory, right? It's not the law of learning. And so its weaknesses will be addressed when we discuss our other two theories of learning. All right, and so we'll do practice in class using all the terminology and the verbiage, and we'll also do some specific applications with the phobia and the taste aversion that is mentioned on this slide. So please bring any questions that you have regarding classical conditioning to class with you. And thank you, as always, for listening. Bye.